Good evening. This is the 13th class of this series. Today we are talking about emancipation and assimilation. The emancipation granted to the Jews in the 18th, in the beginning of the 19th century, gave the Jews equality in socioeconomic position, but it set in motion forces that menaced the survival of the Jewish people. This is a time of new materialism and religious skepticism, an emphasis on different kinds of values. The Jewish community is going to be assaulted. The traditional values of the Jewish community are going to be in danger. And in order to become part of the society of where the environment, to become Frenchmen or Germans, the nations were asking the Jews to renounce their own communal identity, which also put a great deal of danger on the survival of the Jewish community. In fact, just for the information, in the 19th century, perhaps in the first half of the 19th century, we estimate about 200,000 Jews converted to Christianity. There's going to be a difference between Western Europe, France, Germany, and England, and Central Europe, where in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe, the emancipation is going to become immediate and full, granting the Jews civil legal rights like all citizens. Whereas in Central Europe is going to be on and off, gradual with opposition and something that we did not see this before. It all begins, of course, with the French Revolution. French Revolution, the influence of the French Revolution as the effect is felt throughout the entire continent. We see here in France, where a lot of the Jews lived, 50,000 Jews lived at the beginning of the century, 19th century. In 1791, the National Assembly makes a declaration of the rights of man, and Jews are given complete rights and religious freedom. The Jews are so happy and excited about this that they actually join the revolution as well. And Jews, unfortunately, suffer, like all the other Frenchmen, by the guillotine and the reign of terror. But this idea of Jews acquiring legal rights spreads all over. It goes to Holland and to Denmark, and slowly is going to go into Germany, although in a very gradual way. When the French invade Italy, especially Rome, the Republican French army has one major who is a Jew by the name of Barrafael, and a major in the Republican militia. The Pope is captured as a prisoner of war, and the ghetto walls are open. The Jews in Venice also get to their walls of the ghetto are burned, and they go out. The Jews are granted legal rights. However, shortly thereafter, by some sort of a treaty, Venice is ceded to Austria, and Austria still does not have the legal rights that we have elsewhere. All of this comes to a head with Napoleon. Napoleon is the one who brings these armies throughout Europe, to Holland, to Belgium, and to Spain, and to Italy. Of course, this great military genius, who is really the liberator of the Jews, and in fact, he is enamored of the Jews in some way. He's obsessed with the Jews. At one point, he summons the Jews of Asia and Africa to join him to do war against the Turks and liberate Israel, the Holy Land. Unfortunately, he's not able to do that. But one of the things that Napoleon does, that at some point in the middle of his wars, by 1805, 1806, he begins to feel that the Jews are not going to become really Frenchmen. And he convenes what is called a Grand Sanhedrin, a brilliant choice of words, so that the terminology to tell that the Jews was this was a major, very um, authentic meeting of the Jews. So he convenes the Sanhedrin with 71 members, as it were in the original Sanhedrin, with some rabbis and some loyal men, and he poses to them a series of questions. And some of the questions are, are you going to accept France as its fatherland, and you're going to renounce your connection to all the other Jews in other communities? And finally, I mean, all these are very insulting questions. He finally says to them, "You must marry French people." So is a kind of a law that he made in the Sanhedrin that some Jews, a man, has to, at least half of the men have to marry French women, and half of the women have to marry French men and Jewish people. This all ends with what is called the infamous decree of 1808, where he actually says that there will be no there should be no difference between the Jews and the Frenchmen, and the religion is to be a very private matter. This eventually he wants to regulate the religion, and to create what is called the consistoire. Consistoire is a commissions of government that are going to regulate in each community of France and eventually in other countries as well, how the synagogues are going to conduct themselves. What are they going to do? What are they going to, how are they going to speak? Eventually, as you see, this is going to be the beginning of what we eventually is going to become the Reform movement. So, the synagogue is now going to be governed a little bit by to try to make it as French or Dutch as possible. And eventually this ends up with a lot of the Mendelssohn's, remember Moses Mendelssohn's ideas of renewing, of changing the way that Jewish children are educated in Jewish schools. And eventually, synagogues are going to have introduced choral singing and confirmation, and that the sermon is going to be given in the language of the country. And in fact, these people are called no longer Jews. They're to be called French of the Mosaic faith, or Germans of the Mosaic faith. These ideas don't go very well in Galicia, in Poland, and the Russians are not even affected by all of this at all. But in Western Europe, this is a very big challenge. And we're going to see here that this is going to create a great deal of tension in the Jewish community, because some are going to say, we need to change in order to be Frenchmen, to be German, and others are going to say, we are Jews. Now, this is going to end up in some serious way where Jews are going to actually have to renounce the connections with the Jews other countries, because they are French, but they are not Jews. They're going to have to renounce the connection to the Holy Land. And this is the beginning of the separation from their historical roots. More is going to be done by the Reform movement, but this is the beginning of this idea. I want to point out that there are, at this time, developments in England, and I want to discuss the events in England quickly. England established, the right for Jews even early on. There was a big synagogue, Bevis Mark Synagogue, which is even today, 1701 in London, mostly by Sephardic Jews, mostly Marranos. First rabbi was Sir Solomon de Medina, who was also a lord, the first Jew knighted to the parliament. And unfortunately, again, some of them convert to Christianity. in 1813, one of the very important Jews of the community, Isaac the Israeli, baptizes his own son, Benjamin, baptized. And the Israeli is going to become, a Christian, but he's always going to be defending the Jews. In fact, he writes extensively about how great the Jews are, which is an interesting idea that, although he was a Christian, he always admired the Jews and defended the Jews. In fact, at one point, and I want to point out quickly, in England is a very important aspect, the Benjamin Disraeli becomes prime minister of England twice. He writes and he explains that the Jews are a very good example of how society and the economy should conduct itself. Its conservative views, Israeli wasn't a conservative, the conservative philosophy, politically, came from admiring how the Jews were doing so well in business, and the admiration of how the Jews enterprising, initiative, creativity. This, he said, this is what is going to change Europe. I want you to pay attention to this because it is interesting that the Israeli admire this aspect in the Jews, which is exactly what Karl Marx is going to despise and criticize seriously, the enterprising aspect of the Jews. Let me talk to you about the most important example of this enterprise, this enterprising Jew. Jews were really in all professions by now. They were physicians, as always, and law. Some of them had become lawyers and writers, and we will talk a little bit about this in a moment. But first, I want to discuss with you this great family from Frankfurt, the Rothschilds. I want to talk a little bit about the Rothschilds. By the way, the word Rothschild comes from the fact that in the Judengasse, the Jewish street in Frankfurt, the Jews were identified by shields. So, for example, the shield of the Rothschild was a red shield. That's what Rothschild means. And then there was the Schiff family was because they were identified by a ship, the sign of a ship, and so on. So, I want to say that this idea, one of the factors of emancipation to give the Jews rights was precisely because they were a very important part in the economy. So their success in industry, in trade, and in banking made the Jews very prominent, so that although the idea of emancipation in France may have been an ideological matter, all over Europe, it was a necessity to integrate the Jews into the economy. So let's talk about the Rothschild. The founder of the House of the Rothschild was Meyer Anschel, died in 1812, and he was a banker in Frankfurt. But the greatest innovator of the family was his third son, Nathan Meyer Rothschild, born in 1777, and he went to London, where he became the great banker, together with his brothers in Frankfurt, Vienna, and in Paris. They actually control Europe. They created a new system of giving people, the governments, they guaranteed loans with notes. They were the first people to create the concept of shares, to give individuals shares to invest. They created the paper investment, and they became involved in everything. They gave money to Spain and to the German princes. Nobody could do any business because they were the bankers, so they were able to control currency. The Rothschild, by the way, also were able to transport bullion safely. So everybody who needed something went to the Rothschilds. The Rothschilds being involved also in a great deal of industry, creating, for example, the railways in particularly in France. The French used to say that since Rothschild Frere was everywhere, RF stands for Rothschild Frère, are also the initials of the République Française. So when people said, we saw the sign for the République Française, it says this is really Rothschild Frère. They were married, or into their family came another Jew, Moses Montefiore, who was also knighted. Montefiore was born in Italy, and he came to England. And interestingly enough, he became a very good friend of the Queen Victoria, who knighted him. And one of the reasons that apparently Queen Victoria was very close to the Jews was because of her friendship with Sir Moses Montefiore. One of the Rothschilds, of course, was Edmond de Rothschild, Yaakov Rothschild, who was one of the most important contributors to the settlement in Israel later on. He was called the Anadvana Yadua, the famous philanthropist. And Zichron Yaakov, for example, it's created in his name. So these are the great aspect. And the first Rothschild, Lionel de Rothschild, is elevated to the House of Commons in the year 1847. It's interesting that the Jews, the Rothschilds now are all over the world, controlling a great deal of industries, banking, governments, and need always money from them. The bankers of Germany also are there are other bankers of Germany, Goldsmiths, for example, and these are also the people who are going to help Bismarck. And the unification of Germany had a great deal to do with the influence of these Jewish bankers in Frankfurt. I want to tell you quickly a joke about the Rothschilds, that they say a story that once the Rothschilds went to, in one of the trips, they had to go to Poland, and they stopped at an inn, and they order 2 eggs. At the end of the meal, the innkeeper gives them a bill, and it says for 25 rubles, which is an enormous amount of money. So the Rothschild says, "Why so much? Are the eggs so rare here?" He says, "No, eggs are not, but the Rothschilds are." So the Rothschilds were very famous all over the world. I want to point out now something that we will discuss a little bit later, what Jews were doing with religion. But before I talk about their attitudes towards religion, I want to talk about what was happening in the 19th century, now with the Emancipation. Jews could be illustrious Jewish statesmen, writers, musicians, physicians, philosophers, playwrights, and soldiers who could be found in every country in Europe. Just going to give you a few names of people. Adolphe Crémier was appointed Minister of Justice in France in 1850. Crémier was the Minister of Justice. Now, as Minister of Justice, his job was to control and appoint all religious ministers, including the Catholics. Now, what an ironical fact. A Jew was appointing bishops in Catholic France. Crémier was also a very important leader. I want you to pay attention to him. He is the first president of an organization called Alliance Israélite Universelle, a very important educational organization that created schools all over the Middle East. In fact, my grandmother was a student at the Alliance. We'll talk in a moment about. I want to talk about other Jews, important Jews. The composer, Halevi, the composer of the opera La Juive, Offenbach, all. And of course, there was the father of Giacomo Meyerbeer was, as we will see later, one of the leaders of the community in Berlin. He had created the first probably Reformed synagogue in Berlin was by Herz Baer. Herz Baer was the father of Giacomo Meyerbeer, who was a very important opera composer. The Jews also were in the arts, Rachel and Sarah Bernard. A very important person, and we'll talk about it in a moment, is a Heinrich Heine. Heine, unfortunately, probably one of the greatest poets of Germany after Goethe, and together with Goethe. He wrote many great poems which were set to music. A lot of the Lieder that of Schubert and Schumann are based on the writings of Heinrich Heine. Now, who was Heine, and what was his story? Heine is the archetype of the new phenomenon, the Jewish phenomenon. A person who wants to enter into society, in a sense, converting to Christianity is the way to enter the society, and he rejected Judaism. He rejected all Judaism, but most of all, he despised Reform Judaism, because he said Reform Judaism is like Christianity. He preferred the Orthodoxy at all. He became a Protestant. He later regretted his baptism, and actually, he was a radical. We will talk a little bit about why are Jews radical in a moment. From Emancipation onwards, we're going to see the Jews are going to be fighting for the rights of man everywhere. So they were opposing monarchs, authoritarian governments, and therefore they became the representative, in a sense, of revolution. And although he eventually became more conservative in his views, he died regretting that he had converted, and he writes, "It is no secret of my Judaism, to which I have not returned since I never left it," which is not entirely true, but that is Heinrich Heine, a convert to Christianity, who regretted. In Paris, he made somebody else, and that another person whose father had converted him to Christianity, Karl Marx. And Karl Marx is an important figure. I want to talk Karl Marx because he is the clear representative of the revolutionary, particularly spearheading the 1848 revolution in Paris, which was a revolution that tried to destroy, create, the kingdom, create a constitutional government. But Karl Marx, it's interesting that one of his first writings is called The Jewish Question. He discusses what is the role the Jews have to do in society. And he writes this extraordinarily hate-filled document saying that the Jews really have changed the world order because they have made money the most important commodity in the world. And he says that the jealous God of Israel is money. And he said the God of the Jews has been secularized and become the God of the world. Very terrible story. Marx becomes, of course, the famous architect of Marxism, the concept that people have to live, that capitalism is evil. In fact, looking at the Rothschilds and what the Jews have done, exactly what the Israeli had admired is exactly what Marx complained and despised. And unfortunately, despite his anti-Jewish rhetoric, many Jews were attracted to him, as we know even till this very day. Another Jew who was also a socialist was Ferdinand Lassalle from Breslau. He's the father of German socialism. So it's interesting that we see here these people reacting to the events of the world, and this is a point that I think it's important to realize. What the Jews in the world were doing, they were not just fighting for themselves. They were fighting really to overthrow the old system. And in fact, they celebrated. They were on the side of the forces that created constitutional governments. It's interesting. In addition to Lassalle, who was the father of German socialism, we also have a lot of other people. In Italy, the head of the new Venetian Republic was a converted Jew, about Daniel Manin. The first prime minister of Italy is Luigi Luzzati, also the Jews were active in politics. The Jews played a very important role in helping Garibaldi in the reunification of Germany. So the question is, the Jews were saying that in order to solve the Jewish problems, they needed to stand up and fight for the rights, and also for the rights of all downtrodden humanity. But perhaps this is one of the reasons why Jews become so involved in socialism, in the concept that to the extent that socialism represents the overthrow of a system that is oligarchic and aristocratic and so on, kings. So to some extent, that makes sense that the Jews, in order to fit into the society, needed to overthrow that old system and create a constitutional republic where they would be more welcome as equals. And that is the reason why we will see that many Jews later on are going to be involved in Jewish affairs and in political affairs, but not to their Jewish interests. Ferdinand Nassau, for example, or other Germans who were working they were working for the overall, the humanity, even if they contradicted their own Jewish interests. Sometimes the purposes, the ideals of humanity were more important than the Jewish interests, something that unfortunately we see very often here. Unfortunately, Jews, despite doing all of this and being part of the revolution and being more German than the Germans and more Hungarian than the Hungarians, eventually we're going to see that this is not seen with great joy. The Jews are going to be criticized, number one, for trying too hard to fit into the society, and also they're going to be attacked for trying to destroy that society. An ironic aspect of how the Jews are being treated. I want to talk about today, because of the time that we are discussing, the very important event that happened in 1840 called the Blood for the Damascus Blood Libel. In 1840, in Damascus, Syria, a Capuchin friar is found dead. And the authorities immediately suggest that the Jews killed him in order to take the blood. It was before Pesach, to make matzah, reviving that old blood libel of the Middle Ages. The French, it's interesting, a government that ironically had given too many rights to the Jews, but they were anti-Semitic. And the French consul immediately incites the masses and tells them, you're right, this is what the Jews do. And in this terrible connection, they arrest a barber by the name of Solomon Negrin, who unfortunately under torture confesses his sin, which is obviously not true. They arrest 63 children and other people, a whole disaster. Fortunately, in a way, one of the people arrested was an Austrian citizen, which makes all the big powers, the great powers of the world, become involved in this event. I want to point, by the way, that not all the Jews were concerned about these Jews in Damascus. And one of the people who was not concerned was Abraham Geiger, one of the philosophers of Reform Judaism. He said, I'm not interested in the Jews of Asia. All right. But the Jews get involved. And the most important person to get involved is Moses Montefiore, gets the approval of the Queen, and together with Adolphe Crémier, the one from France, as we discussed, and another scholar, Solomon Monk. They go to Syria. The Jews are released, and the Muhammad Ali, the Sultan in Turkey, Alexandria, actually makes a declaration that the accusation of ritual murder is a gross libel that should never be invoked anymore. Unfortunately, the Arabs have revived it in this generation. So the Jews now come back, and the people are celebrating. And this is the first time that we need. It's interesting, as the people are saying we are Frenchmen, we are Germans, but we now begin to see the bond that binds, the common bond that binds Jewry all over the world. Never before had the Jews achieved this success on behalf of their people. And Montefiore remains, for that reason, constantly involved in the settlement, in helping the Jews. He's going to go to help the Jews in Russia, and especially he helps them in Israel. I want to point out quickly that for those of you who know, the famous windmill in Jerusalem was something that Montefiore had done. And if you remember, in Jerusalem, you see the carriage that he used to, by which he was to travel in Israel. He also created the first neighborhood outside of the walls called Mishkenot Sha'ananim, just outside of the walls next to the windmill. So this was Sir Moses Montefiore, a friend, a very good friend of Queen Victoria, a knighted as a lord in England, a man who remains a very important active element of for the Jewish people, more than anyone. Perhaps he and Edmund Rothschild were the people who really did so much for the Jews all over the world. I want to end up with another story, and this story is a terrible story, but it only shows how, even though the Jews were being granted emancipation and considered to be legal rights, nevertheless, there was still a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism, which we're going to talk about it next time. And this, I'm going to refer to called the Mortara affair. In the year 1858, the Pope, a very terrible Pope, Pius IX, who actually had forced the Jews of Rome to go back to the ghetto, he kidnaps a child, 7-year-old child, called Edgardo Mortara, from the city of Bologna, on the ground, from his Jewish parents, against the will of the parents, by saying that this boy was Christian. How was he Christian? When the boy was a baby, they had a servant who was Catholic. Apparently the boy had been sick in some way. And so the girl, in order to pray for him, love the boy, sprinkled some water on him and baptized him. Apparently at some point she commented this story to some bishop and some priest, and eventually went all the way to the Pope. So they said that since he was baptized as a baby, against his will, against the will of the parents, he was a Christian. And nothing could be done to stop this idea. They took the boy by force. The parents did everything. Montefiore was involved, and lawyers all over the world. Again, a little bit like the blood libel in a different way. And unfortunately, they were not successful. And unfortunately, the popes at this time were really the papal states all over Italy until the reunification added more restrictions on the Jews. As I said, Pius IX brought the Jews back to the ghetto. It was a very terrible story. And we see here that the emancipation of the Jews caused, therefore, two problems. On the one hand, it created a problem that in order to fit with everybody else, they had to renounce their identity. And on the other hand, no matter what they did, everybody was treating them anyway as Jews separately anyway. And we see here that all over, the Jews had to fight to gain their identity, to preserve their identity, as they were in a world that was not accepting them. So it's interesting. I want to summarize this idea that the Jews, by getting emancipation, they had to renounce a great deal of their own past history. And it's precisely this, that the non-Jews wanted the Jews. They said the Jews could never do that. The Jews could never renounce their identity. So no matter what they did, someone like even like the Israeli or somebody like Heine, they were still obsessed with their own Jewishness, which in a sense is a sign that a Jew can never renounce who he is. And we know that in the Holocaust, Hitler, actually considered a person a Jew if he had a grandparent who was Jewish. So we see that Jewish could never abandon the Jewish. I want to end next week. We're going to be discussing the other aspects of the 19th century, which is how Jews reacted in the synagogue, the Reform movement, and so on, and the beginning of what we call the nationalism that is going to lead to the idea, anti-Semitism and nationalism are going to ultimately result in the creation of the Zionist movement. And this will be next week. But I want to end with one story, how difficult it is for the Jews to renounce who they are. There's a story of a man who wanted to join a country club, and they asked him, where do you live? He gives the address. He says, what do you do? He told them what he does, the profession. He says, and religion? He says, why are you asking me? I am a goy. So sometimes, Jews can never forget who they are. All right, with this, we're going to close the class. And please, anybody who would like to have a question, I'd be happy to welcome it.